The sun in Ouagadougou had a way of pressing down on everything. It was not just heat, it was a weight, a reminder of the land's relentlessness. On the edge of the city, heaps of discarded rubber tires piled high like black mountains. They sat in silence, remnants of imported cars that had long outlived their journeys. Most saw these tires as waste, symbols of poverty and the absence of modern recycling plants. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré saw something different. He had walked through these neighborhoods many times, visiting the people, listening to their stories. Children played hide and seek in the hollow rings of old tires, while women complained about the smoke that filled the air whenever the tires were burned to make room for new trash. For years, the sight had disturbed him, not just because of the pollution, but because of the irony. Here lay mountains of durable material. Yet the country still struggled with crumbling, pothole-ridden roads. One evening, as the call to prayer drifted across the city and the orange sky softened into dusk, Traoré stopped near a massive pile of tires. He ran his hand across the rubber surface, rough with dust, and whispered to himself, "Why can't this be a road?" It was a question that seemed absurd at first. Roads were built with asphalt, concrete, heavy machinery, and billions in foreign contracts. Roads were political weapons, handed out by foreign donors who reminded Africans, again and again, of their dependence. A road built from waste? A road born from the people's own hands? That was not how the world worked. But Traoré was not a man who believed in the limitations set by others. For months he had been thinking about development differently. He was tired of conferences where foreign experts lectured African leaders about proper infrastructure, only for the projects to fail a few years later. He was tired of waiting for loans that came with hidden chains. What if, instead of waiting, Burkina Faso built with what it already had? What if the path to independence was not through aid, but through ingenuity? The thought grew into an obsession. He began to sketch rough designs on scraps of paper, an interlocking structure of tires, filled with compressed earth, layered and bound together until they formed a strong, resilient roadbed. The idea was radical, almost laughable, but in his mind, it was possible. Rubber did not rot like wood. It did not crumble like weak asphalt. It bent under pressure, absorbed shocks, and endured heat. Tires could outlast the roads that foreign contractors built. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This was not just an engineering challenge. It was a political statement. If he could build one road, just one stretch of highway, that lasted longer, cost less, and required no foreign funding, it would prove something dangerous to the global order, that Africans could build for themselves. In the quiet of his office, Traoré laid out his plan to a small circle of trusted allies. They were young engineers, soldiers who had grown frustrated with seeing villages cut off during rainy seasons, students who dreamed of building something meaningful. Many of them looked at the sketches and laughed nervously. "Captain," one said, "this is madness. Tires cannot be roads." But Traoré leaned forward, his eyes fierce. "Everything they tell us is impossible," he replied, "until we do it." From that night, the vision was alive. When Traoré first spoke openly about his idea, the room went silent. A handful of young engineers, military officers, and community organizers stared at him in disbelief. In their minds, roads were symbols of wealth, gleaming black, asphalt laid by foreign companies with enormous machines. To suggest that a road could be built from discarded tires was like suggesting a palace could be built from broken bottles. "Captain," one engineer finally said, choosing his words carefully, with respect, "this is not how the world builds roads. It will collapse in a season." But Traoré did not flinch. He leaned forward, tapping his finger on the table. "Tell me," he asked, "how many kilometers of asphalt roads have lasted even 5 years here? How many of those projects are still standing without foreign companies coming back for more money?" Silence again. The truth was painful. Everyone in that room had traveled roads that had crumbled within a year, washed away by the rains. Everyone had seen how much money was poured into foreign contracts, only for the results to dissolve into dust and potholes. What if, Traoré continued, we build something different? What if we prove that a road made from our own waste, our own hands, can survive longer than their million-dollar highways? Would that not be worth trying? It was not logic that convinced them, but his fire. Within weeks, he organized small teams to begin collecting tires. Soldiers were dispatched to remote villages, telling locals to bring in old rubber in exchange for small stipends. Children dragged tires from abandoned lots. Women dug them out from piles of junk. And truckloads of black rubber began to appear outside a military warehouse. What had once been mountains of garbage was transforming into raw material. The sight shocked even the skeptics. Piles of tires grew higher and higher, forming a wall of possibility. It was clear now, there was no turning back. But gathering the tires was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in proving that the material could be engineered into something solid. Traoré invited a group of university students studying civil engineering to the warehouse. They were bright-eyed, eager to test themselves against something bold. He gave them a simple command: show me how this can work. The students experimented. They cut the tires, packed them with layers of soil and gravel, and compressed them under weight. They discovered that once filled tightly, the hollow rings became almost as solid as stone. Interlocked. In rows, they resisted shifting. With proper layering and binding, they could form a foundation strong enough to carry trucks. One student looked up, her hands dirty with rubber dust, and said with amazement, "Captain, this might actually work." Word spread quickly. In the markets, in the mosques, in the tea shops, people began to whisper about the tire road. Some called it foolish, others called it brilliant, but all agreed it was different. And then came the first test. On the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a stretch of land was cleared. Volunteers gathered under the burning sun, dragging stacks of tires into neat rows. Children carried buckets of soil, women shoveled gravel. Soldiers supervised the compaction. It was not just construction, it was a festival of defiance. People laughed, sweated, argued, and cheered as the black skeleton of a road began to take shape. Days turned into weeks. The road slowly grew, tire by tire, layer by layer. What once looked like trash was transforming into a surface smooth enough to walk on, strong enough to carry weight. For the first time, people began to believe. Late one evening, when the workers had gone home, Traoré stood alone at the edge of the half-finished road. The air smelled of dust and sweat, but beneath it he felt something else, the smell of change. He walked slowly across the rubber and earth, listening to the firmness under his boots. It was not yet complete. It was not yet proven. But it was real. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun had set in a band of red fire, and whispered to himself, "They will laugh at us. They will mock us. But one day, they will drive on this road and they will." No, Burkina Faso does not wait for permission. The first steps had been taken. The project site on the outskirts of Ouagadougou had become a hive of activity. From dawn until dusk, the sound of shovels striking earth, and the rhythm of hammers, echoed across the dry fields. Piles of tires lay in neat stacks, waiting to be filled with soil and gravel. The heat was brutal, 38 degrees. Sometimes more, but still the workers came. They came because they believed in Traoré, and because the work felt different. This was not a contract signed in Paris or Washington. This was theirs. The first rows of tires were laid with precision. Soldiers directed the placement, ensuring that each ring was aligned and interlocked like bricks. Children carried small buckets of earth, dumping them into the hollow spaces. Women shoveled gravel and tamped it down, their laughter mixing with the sound of effort. But progress was slow. The tires resisted uniformity. Some were too worn, some too stiff, and others cracked under pressure. Dust stung the workers' eyes, and more than once entire rows had to be torn up and rebuilt. The engineers argued constantly. Should the tires be cut in half to flatten them? Should they be stacked 2 layers deep or 3? Every decision carried risk. If the road failed, the world would say it was proof of Africa's backwardness. One evening, frustration boiled over. A young engineer threw down his shovel and shouted, "This is impossible. We are wasting time. A road must be built with asphalt, not garbage." The workers fell silent, their hope trembling. All eyes turned to Traoré. He stepped forward, his uniform streaked with dust and sweat, and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Do you know what's truly impossible?" He asked softly, "Waiting another 50 years for the world to take us seriously. depending forever on loans that chain us to debt, watching our children grow up believing we cannot build with our own hands. That, he said, voice rising, is impossible. This is only difficult. The words struck like fire. The engineer lowered his head, ashamed, and returned to work. After that night, something shifted. The workers no longer treated the tires as junk but as bricks of a new future. They experimented with techniques, packing the earth tighter, adding binding layers of clay, testing each section with the weight of carts and motorcycles. Slowly, the road grew more stable. Then came the moment of truth. 2 weeks into the build, Traoré ordered a military truck to drive across the first completed section. The workers gathered nervously on both sides, watching as the heavy vehicle rolled forward. The tires crunched softly beneath its wheels. For a moment, everyone held their breath. The road held. The truck reached the other side without a single crack, without a single tire dislodged. Dust rose in a golden cloud, and when it settled, the cheers erupted. Women ululated, children clapped, men lifted their shovels into the air. For the first time, they knew it was possible. From that day on, the pace accelerated. Villagers from farther away began to arrive, curious to witness the miracle road. Some came only to watch, but many stayed to help. Food vendors set up stalls at the site, turning the construction zone into a marketplace. At night, songs were sung around fires as people celebrated the work they had accomplished together. But not everyone celebrated. In the capital, whispers began to circulate. Foreign advisors scoffed at the idea of a trash road. Some local officials worried about the embarrassment if it failed. There were even rumors that powerful interests, tied to international construction, companies wanted the project shut down. Traoré ignored them. He knew what was at stake. This was no longer just about building a road, it was about building dignity. Every tire laid, every shovel of earth, was a message. Burkina Faso would not wait for permission to innovate. As the weeks passed, the black skeleton of the road stretched farther into the horizon. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense, no glossy asphalt, no painted lines, but to those who built it, it was magnificent. It was proof that even the discarded could become the foundation of progress. And though the world did not yet know it, the road was about to spark shockwaves far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The tire road was no longer just a construction site, it had become a gathering place. Word spread quickly across the villages. They are building a road from trash, and it is holding. At first, people came out of curiosity, eager to see the strange black surface stretching across the land. But curiosity soon transformed into participation. Mothers brought their sons and daughters, saying, "Learn from this. This is what it means to build with your own hands." Farmers arrived after long days in the fields, offering their strength. Schoolchildren came in groups, their teachers explaining that this was history in the making. Even the elders, leaning on canes, stood proudly at the roadside, blessing the workers with prayers. It became a movement. Women formed work teams, carrying baskets of soil on their heads, laughing as they marched in lines. Their voices rose in song, ancient rhythms of labor that made the long hours lighter. Youth organized themselves into brigades, racing each other to see who could fill and pack the most tires in a day. Artisans began carving wooden signs that read, "The road of the people," planting them along the path. The road was no longer Traoré's idea alone. It belonged to everyone. Each evening, as the sun fell behind the horizon, the construction site turned into a community square. Fires were lit, drums were brought out, and griots told stories of ancient kings who built kingdoms with their courage. Now, they said, a new story was being written, not in stone or gold, but in rubber and earth. Children's eyes sparkled as they listened, dreaming of the future that this road symbolized. For many, the road became a source of pride. They began to measure their lives by it. "I carried 10 buckets today." A child would boast. "I laid 3 rows of tires," another replied. Husbands and wives teased each other about who work harder. Even the skeptics who once mocked the project now came quietly to help, unable to deny the spirit that had taken root. But the road was more than just physical labor. It was a psychological revolution. 4 generations. The people had been told that progress would only come from outside, from aid, from foreign experts, from imported solutions. Now, for the first time, They saw progress emerging from their own sweat. It was empowering, intoxicating. The people began to whisper a new phrase to one another. If we can build a road from trash, what else can we build? Traoré understood the importance of this transformation. He often walked among the workers without ceremony, listening to their stories, encouraging their efforts. When a group of women asked him, half joking, if the road would carry their heavy market baskets without breaking, he laughed and replied, if it can carry trucks, it can carry your baskets too. This road is stronger than it looks, just like you. The laughter spread, and so did the belief. Soon, the road site resembled not only a construction project but a festival. Merchants arrived to sell food, grilled corn, steaming pots of rice and sauce, sweet hibiscus drinks to cool the heat. Musicians played balafons and koras, their rhythms pushing the workers to keep going. The site was alive, buzzing with hope. But the deeper meaning could not be ignored. The road was becoming more than a piece of infrastructure. It was a symbol of independence. Each tire placed into the ground declared, we do not need to beg to build. We do not need permission to progress. We are enough. Foreign observers who visited the site were astonished. They expected chaos, failure, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, they saw order, energy, and determination. One journalist from abroad wrote, half in disbelief, it looks less like construction and more like a celebration. They are not just building a road. They are building a movement. As the days passed and the road stretched further into the horizon, one truth became undeniable. The project was no longer a question of engineering. It was a question of identity. And the people of Burkina Faso had answered. Months of sweat and determination had led to this moment. The tire road now stretched for several kilometers across the dusty plains. From a distance, it looked unusual, dark and textured, unlike the glossy asphalt highways shown in foreign advertisements. But up close, it was solid, compact, and undeniably real. The once jagged piles of discarded rubber had been transformed into a continuous lifeline that cut through the land. The day of the first official test was set. By sunrise, crowds had already gathered. Men, women, and children lined both sides of the road, craning their necks to see. Drums echoed in the distance, and market vendors had set up stalls, turning the event into a festival. Some whispered prayers, others crossed their fingers nervously. Everyone knew that this day would decide whether their months of work had been a triumph or a tragedy. Traoré arrived quietly, not in a parade of cars but on foot, walking among his people. He shook hands, accepted blessings, and listened to their hopes. Then he stood before the crowd, lifted his voice, and said, "Today is not about me. It is about you, the hands that built this road, the hearts that believed. Whatever happens, remember this, no one can ever again say that we cannot build with our own strength." The crowd roared in approval. The first test was simple. A group of children were invited to run across the road. They laughed and sprinted from one end to the other, their bare feet slapping against the rubber surface. The road held firm. Parents clapped and cheered. Next came the motorcycles. Dozens of young men revved their engines and sped down the stretch, their tires screeching against the black surface. Dust rose, but the road remained unshaken. Finally, it was time for the ultimate test, a convoy of heavy trucks loaded with sand. The crowd fell silent as the first truck lurched forward, its massive weight pressing down on the road. The sound of its engine thundered in the hot air. All eyes watched as the wheels rolled across the tire surface. The ground trembled. A few children gasped. But the road held. One truck passed. Then another. Then 5 more. Each one crossed the stretch without causing cracks or collapse. By the time the last truck rolled to a halt, the silence broke into an explosion of cheers. Women danced, men lifted their arms, and children shouted with joy. The impossible had become reality. For many, tears flowed freely. Old men wiped their eyes, whispering, "We never thought we'd live to see this." Mothers hugged their children tightly, knowing they had witnessed history. Students scribbled notes furiously, recording every detail for the future. Traoré stood at the center of it all, watching the people celebrate. His heart swelled, not with pride for himself, but with pride for them. They had proven the world wrong together. This was not a road of foreign aid or borrowed machines. It was a road of will, imagination, and resilience. That evening, when the crowds finally dispersed, a smaller group remained. They lit fires by the roadside and cooked meals, too excited to sleep. Stories were told of how the road had begun, of the long days of labor, of the moment the trucks crossed without breaking it. Already, the event was turning into legend. And beyond Burkina Faso, whispers began to spread. News of the Tire Road reached neighboring countries. Journalists started arriving, cameras in hand, eager to capture the story. Some dismissed it as a novelty. Others declared it a revolution. But one thing was clear: the road was no longer just a physical structure. It was proof. Proof that waste could be reborn as strength. Proof that innovation could come from the ground up. Proof that when people believed in themselves, they could defy the entire world's expectations. And this was only the beginning. News travels fast in the modern world. And the Tire Road of Ouagadougou was no exception. Within weeks of the first successful test, videos and photos began appearing online. At first, they were shared quietly, clips of children running across the rubber surface, motorcycles racing, trucks rolling safely. But the unusual method caught attention quickly. International journalists flew in, some skeptical, others curious. In Washington, news analysts paused mid-sentence as the images flashed across screens. Even former President Donald Trump, scrolling through social media, reportedly raised an eyebrow. He had seen infrastructure projects before, billions spent, contracts signed, glossy photos, but a road made of old tires? That was new. It's incredible, a senior aide supposedly murmured. I've never seen anything like it. In Europe, engineers debated the implications. Some called it a novel but untested experiment, while others privately admitted they were impressed by the resilience demonstrated. The concept challenged decades of conventional wisdom. Asphalt and concrete were no longer the only paths to functional infrastructure. Meanwhile, local African leaders began whispering in corridors. If a small country like Burkina Faso could innovate independently, what did that mean for their own reliance on foreign aid? Could this be the start of a new model of self-reliance? Traoré, back in Ouagadougou, paid little attention to the political noise. He was more interested in the practical outcomes. But the pressure from outside was tangible. Foreign construction companies were unsettled. Their contracts and influence seemed suddenly vulnerable to a method that cost almost nothing, relied entirely on local materials, and used local labor. Experts who had long lectured African nations on proper development suddenly faced a counterexample they could not easily dismiss. Meanwhile, social media exploded. Videos went viral, hashtags multiplied, and the road became a symbol of grassroots ingenuity. Memes appeared showing rubber tires carrying trucks with captions like, "Who needs asphalt when you have Africa's creativity?" The Tire Road was being discussed in boardrooms, universities, and policy meetings far beyond Burkina Faso. Some Western commentators tried to downplay the achievement, calling it a temporary novelty. Others were forced to admit that the experiment had passed real-world tests. Trucks, motorcycles, and even buses had traversed the path without incident. Trump's reaction, in particular, became the subject of speculation. Some journalists joked about him not seeing it coming, as if the road's existence were a minor geopolitical shock. But beneath the humor was a serious implication. A nation, long dependent on foreign assistance, had demonstrated an independent solution that worked. Local communities, meanwhile, celebrated quietly. They did not care about the headlines abroad. For them, the road was tangible proof that they could change their reality. Traoré walked among them, listening to stories of how travel had become easier, how markets were more accessible, and how children could go to school without fear of getting stuck in mud during the rains. And yet, the world continued to watch, some with admiration, some with skepticism. The Tire Road had become more than infrastructure. It was a symbol, a question, a challenge to traditional power structures. Could innovation and resilience truly come from below, rather than from imported solutions? Could a leader who turned waste into infrastructure redefine how development was imagined? For Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso, the answer was already clear. They had built the road, and they had done it themselves. By the time the tire road had stretched for several kilometers, it was no longer just a local triumph, it had become a model. Leaders from neighboring countries began sending delegations to Ouagadougou. They wanted to see the road, inspect the engineering, and understand how a country could achieve such results without billion-dollar loans or foreign contractors. Many were hesitant at first, expecting gimmicks or temporary fixes. What they found instead was precision, care, and resilience. One minister from a West African nation stepped onto the road and remarked, "If we had this vision and discipline in our own country, we could change the way infrastructure is built across the continent." His words were cautious, yet filled with admiration. Traoré welcomed each visitor personally, walking them along the road, explaining the layering, the compaction techniques, and the rationale behind each decision. He was patient, showing how local labor and discarded materials could achieve results far beyond what traditional methods allowed. Engineers and students took meticulous notes. Photographers documented the road's durability. Videos were made to show step-by-step instructions for replication. The tire road was slowly becoming a blueprint for self-reliant infrastructure. Back in Ouagadougou, the local people watched with pride as dignitaries inspected their work. Children pointed out the exact rows they had helped fill. Women explained how they had carried baskets of soil and gravel. It was no longer just Traoré's vision, it was a collective achievement, celebrated and validated on an international stage. As news traveled, NGOs and regional development organizations could not ignore the success. Some approached cautiously, offering guidance on how to replicate the method. But many quickly realized that this was not about outside expertise. It was about empowering local communities. The tire road model showed that Africa did not need to wait for foreign intervention to innovate. The idea began to spread like wildfire. Other villages in Burkina Faso started their own tire projects, small roads connecting schools, markets, and health clinics. Across West Africa, discussions erupted about the potential of recycled materials in infrastructure. Could Africa bypass decades of dependency and create solutions that were cheaper, faster, and more resilient? Some critics continued to scoff. "It's a novelty," they said. "It cannot replace modern engineering." But even skeptics had to acknowledge one undeniable fact: the tire road worked. It carried trucks, motorcycles, and buses reliably. It survived heavy rains and heat. And it was built entirely by local hands, with local materials. Traoré knew this was only the beginning. The tire road was more than a path for vehicles. It was a symbol of independence and ingenuity. He envisioned networks of similar roads connecting villages, towns, and regions. Each stretch of tire and soil would carry a message. Africa could build for itself. In offices and capitals across the continent, whispers grew louder. Leaders who had relied heavily on foreign aid began to reconsider their strategies. Traoré's road was not just a construction project, it was a challenge to the old model of development. And for the people who had built it, the tire road became a source of identity and empowerment. They walked it with pride, knowing that they had turned discarded waste into something meaningful, durable, and transformative. The road was no longer an experiment. It was a statement that change could start from the ground up. With fame came scrutiny. As news of the tire road spread, Western engineers, infrastructure specialists, and international development organizations began weighing in. Headlines appeared: "Rubber road experiment, unproven engineering." Analysts questioned durability, safety, and long-term feasibility. Some labeled it a novelty, warning that it might fail under real-world pressures. In conference rooms in Paris, London, and Washington, experts debated the project. "It is not up to international standards," one senior engineer reportedly said. "What if it collapses during the rainy season?" Another added, "How can we endorse this as a model for development?" But in Burkina Faso, the reactions were different. Local communities who had built and used the road ignored the skepticism. They saw the reality with their own eyes. Trucks rolled safely. Motorcycles raced across without incident. And even the heaviest rainfall had barely left a mark. Every complaint from abroad only strengthened their resolve. Traoré himself addressed critics calmly, often reminding them of a simple fact: you can critique from a distance. But until you've built a road with your own hands, you do not know what is possible here. We measure results by reality, not theory. The tension between local innovation and external expertise became a story in itself. Western observers were frustrated that their decades of traditional approaches had been bypassed, while the people on the ground celebrated a breakthrough they had created. Independently, media coverage intensified. Some journalists reported skeptically, questioning the road's longevity. Others, however, highlighted its ingenuity, calling it a grassroots revolution in infrastructure. Social media users around the world debated heatedly. Could Africa really redefine the way development was done? Could innovation bypass foreign aid entirely? Meanwhile, students, volunteers, and villagers continued to maintain and expand the road. They experimented with improvements, reinforcing weak sections, smoothing the surface, and documenting the process meticulously. Every challenge was met with solutions developed on the spot, often using nothing more than local tools and ingenuity. For the people of Burkina Faso, criticism from afar was irrelevant. Their pride grew each day. The road had become a symbol of resilience, creativity, and independence. It was more than infrastructure. It was a declaration. We can solve our problems ourselves. Even skeptics who visited the site often left reluctantly impressed. One European engineer admitted firmness of the compacted tires beneath his boots. He smiled softly. This was more than a road. It was hope, silent but unyielding, spreading quietly across the land. And while the world debated, laughed, or ignored it, the revolution had already begun. The tire road had proven itself. Trucks rolled smoothly, motorcycles raced across it, and villagers traversed it on foot every day. But for Traoré, this was only the beginning. He envisioned networks of roads connecting distant villages, linking markets and schools, hospitals, and towns. He imagined bridges built with recycled materials, homes constructed using innovative local techniques, and entire communities empowered to create their own infrastructure. Each project, no matter how small, would reinforce the lesson of self-reliance, that the people could build what they needed, without waiting for outside permission. Traoré met with engineers, students, and community leaders to plan future projects. They discussed the potential for modular construction, experimenting with different combinations of materials, and expanding the model across the nation. The lessons learned from the tire road became a blueprint for sustainable, low-cost development. Across Africa, whispers of the tire road success inspired similar initiatives. Communities in neighboring countries began experimenting with recycled materials for roads. Schools and community centers, regional conferences highlighted the project as a case study in grassroots innovation. Slowly but surely, the idea of self-reliant development began to gain momentum. Even the international community could not ignore the implications. While some remained skeptical, others acknowledged the undeniable truth: Africa could innovate independently, and ingenuity could thrive outside traditional frameworks of aid and expertise. In Ouagadougou, the local people continued to use and expand the road. Children ran and played along it. Teachers used it as a teaching tool, and villagers walked it with pride. Every tire was a testament to what they could accomplish when they worked together. Traoré stood at the edge of the longest completed section, looking toward the horizon. The sun painted the sky in hues of red and gold, and the road stretched out like a ribbon of possibility. He smiled, knowing that the true success was not just in the engineering, but in the belief it inspired. The tire road had become more than infrastructure. It was hope made tangible. It was a promise that Africa could lead its own path, that innovation could arise from the ground up, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to build it themselves. And as the last light faded, Traoré whispered to the wind, "This is only the beginning. The road leads forward, and so must we." The quiet revolution would continue, tire by tire, village by village, generation by generation. The world had watched. Some mocked, some doubted, some cheered. But in Burkina Faso, a new era had begun. Privately, I came expecting failure, but I cannot deny it. This road works. Traoré and his team smiled quietly at such admissions. They knew that the true measure of success was not international praise. It was the confidence and empowerment of the people who had built it. Through conflict and criticism, one message became clear: real innovation often disrupts expectations. When people are given the freedom to create, they can achieve results far beyond what others consider possible. And the tire road was proof. The tire road's impact reached far beyond the physical stretch of rubber and earth. Across Burkina Faso, a quiet revolution was unfolding. Villagers who had once relied heavily on outside assistance now saw that real change could come from within. Schools were more accessible, markets were better connected, and health clinics could receive supplies without delay. Every trip across the road reminded them, progress did not have to be dictated by foreign aid. Traoré noticed subtle transformations in people's attitudes. Children who once feared failure now experimented with small engineering projects at school. Young adults volunteered to maintain infrastructure in their communities, inspired by the tire road. Women, who had taken leadership roles during construction, continued to organize and influence local development. The road became a living classroom. Each tire and compacted layer told a story of resourcefulness and courage. Teachers used the project to illustrate physics and engineering, while parents used it to teach perseverance and pride. Students sketched diagrams of interlocking tires and soil layers, imagining entire networks of roads stretching across the continent. Even political discourse began to shift. Local leaders began referencing the tire road as a model of self-reliance. Development discussions moved from dependency to empowerment. Traoré's initiative had proven that a nation could redefine its path without waiting for approval from external authorities. Outside observers slowly took notice. Social media posts, documentaries, and news reports described the tire road not just as infrastructure, but as a metaphor. Africa could innovate, build, and lead from within. Conferences in distant capitals discussed the principles behind the project: community involvement, sustainable materials, and locally driven solutions. The term quiet revolution began to circulate. It was quiet not because it was unnoticed, but because it did not rely on traditional power structures to succeed. The change happened organically, at the grassroots level, through the determination and imagination of ordinary people. For Traoré, the significance was clear. The road was never only about rubber and soil, it was about mindset. It was about showing that small steps, taken collectively, could challenge centuries of dependency and reshape futures. One evening, he walked along the stretch of road alone, listening to the cicadas and feeling the one built on resilience, creativity, and the power of people to shape their own destiny.